In this episode, we're going to cover the P&L. It's probably the single most important document for evaluating the health of a business. You can think of it as a report card for a business. It's not always something that young marketers are taught, but understanding a P&L will not only make you a smarter business person, it'll make you a better marketer. I don't know why everything in business seems to have multiple names, but this is no exception. P&L stands for profit and loss statement, but you'll also see it called an income statement. We'll cover today what is a P&L, what does it say about a business, what numbers matter most to marketers, and finally, what are some places you can trip up when you think about or talk about a P&L. If you can understand subtraction, you can understand a P&L. It's just one long subtraction problem, and it covers one period of time, maybe a quarter, maybe a fiscal year. At the top, we have the money coming into the business, call that revenue or sales. In the middle are expenses, what you have to spend to run the business. And at the bottom, what's left over when you subtract expenses from revenue, that's your profit or your income or your earnings. I told you everything has to have multiple names. To keep all these names handy, there's a little vocab list down here that you can refer to. So let's fill out the subtraction problem a little. I've put $1 million in revenue at the top. Now let's start subtracting what it costs to run the business. First up, you've got to pay for what you sell. Whether you're a retailer who's buying stuff from manufacturers and selling it to consumers, or a manufacturer with factories making stuff, you've got to pay for these things before you can sell them. We call this cost of goods, or COGS, C-O-G-S. And this is maybe the most important cost we're going to subtract out. Because this number, in our case 500,000, which leaves 500,000 in what's called gross profit or gross margin, that leaves us the money that now has to fund everything else in the business, from all the other expenses to the profit you hope to return. If you can't make things, cost of goods, for a lot less than you can sell them, revenue, you're in trouble. That's why you hear so much focus in a business around margin. A few more things to understand before we can move on to the kind of expenses that marketers deal with every day. There is, unfortunately, a little fall off from what a business plans as revenue and what it actually gets checks for. These deductions are sometimes called contras because they run counter to revenue, and they include things like returns and sales discounts. They've got to be subtracted out as well. The difference between that total revenue number, usually called gross revenue, and the final revenue, also called net revenue, can really drain dollars if it's not managed well. And that difference has a name. It's called invoice to net, or ITN, and it's something that sales leaders really have to keep a close eye on. Okay, let's get to the rest of the expenses. This next section, after we get done with revenue and cost of goods, is the expenses it takes to run the business. These are generally called operating expenses, or SG&A, which stands for Selling, General, and Administrative Expenses. They include things like salaries and rent and post-it notes and just about everything else except the cost of goods. This is also where the marketing budget lives. This line is usually called A&P, or advertising and promotions. And the most important thing to remember here is that it's an expense. It has to be funded, like everything else, from gross margin dollars. If the business is in trouble, either because it's having trouble getting revenue or because COGS and contras have gone out of control, it's not going to have money to pay its expenses. That's why businesses have layoffs and cut their marketing budgets and stop buying post-it notes. If the number you're subtracting from is getting smaller, managers will try to reduce the expenses subtracted from it. Why? Because that number at the bottom has got to stay positive. At the bottom of the subtraction problem is the operating income, or OPINC, or net profit. That's the money you put in the bank and return to shareholders. The smaller it gets, the unhappier everyone becomes. One more term here before we've done. I've told you that everything has multiple names. You'll sometimes see this operating income number called an EBITDA, and that stands for earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. It's not exactly the same as operating income, but it's close enough for our purposes. Both are ways to measure the core performance of a business. How well are we doing the basic job of making things and selling them at a profit? Now let's take a look at who's responsible for what. There are a lot of lines in a P&L, and different functions of the business have different responsibilities for those lines. First is revenue. As you might suspect, it's mostly sales teams. If you have a direct-to-consumer business, that function is also responsible for revenue. as are distributors or independent sales agencies if you have them. One other thing to mention here, while your sales teams sell, you don't get paid unless the goods deliver. So the operations part of the business has a lot to do with this revenue section. If you're delivering late or not at all, you'll see it here. Those revenue deductions or contras are largely the purview of the sales team and management in the case of discounts, and maybe product teams if the products are being returned. And marketing can even have a hand here. If we're not doing a good job of explaining the value of a product, that may be contributing to returned goods. COGS is mainly the responsibility of the product teams. They're generally charged with making goods at a target cost, and this is what the retail price is based on. If those costs creep up and we can't raise the retail price, we have a margin problem. Marketing can affect the cost of goods as well. If we design overly expensive packaging, let's say, that's going to drive up the cost of goods and impact margins. Down in the operating expenses area, we have salaries managed by human resources, though general management and department heads will have a lot to say about how much staff is needed. And here's A&P, the marketing budget. It's generally planned as a percentage of income, and we'll cover that in a sec. Finally, the rest of these are related to the plant or the day-to-day functions of the business and can be managed by finance or ops or other departments. That's it. That's a P&L. You can see that I added a column to the right of the dollar figures, this yellow column. You'll often see lines in a P&L expressed both in terms of real dollars and as a percent of total revenue. It's a handy way to see which parts of the business are chewing through the most money. So let's touch on some pitfalls before we call it quits. As you can see, there are a lot of terms used when talking about a P&L. Some are synonyms like profit and margin. Some are close but not exactly synonyms like op inc and EBITDA. To make it even more complicated, every business uses a slightly different cocktail of terms. So your best bet is to ask around. Make friends with somebody in finance and pay attention to the terms they use. It's just subtraction, but there are a lot of words in there. We touched a little bit on the importance of healthy margins, but it's worth mentioning again here. And I've added in another term, full price versus off price. The point here is that you shouldn't be fooled by the big number at the top of the P&L. Just because it's getting bigger doesn't always mean the business is getting better. If your margins are lousy, either because of those revenue contras or because your cost of goods is out of control, you could end up with less operating income from a $150 million business than a $100 million one. And that's why that op inc number is so important and what matters most. So pay attention to the whole subtraction problem, not just the top line. One last thing, and that's benchmarks and practices, best practices. You're going to hear things like A&P should never be more than X percent of revenue, or that labor costs, that's people, should never be more than Y percent of revenue. These benchmarks vary from business to business, and they're often open to interpretation. The moral is just to pay attention. They're not gospel, and you can often ask why and sometimes push back. That's it. Thanks for taking the time. This may not be as fun as reviewing creator content, but the more you can learn about the basics of running a business, the better you'll be as a mountain marketer.